And if it's true that Jesus is the smartest person in the room, does Jesus also not understand our relationships? Does he also not understand our anxiety? Does he also not understand our work, our jobs, our leadership? The Apostle Paul writes it this way in Colossians. He says that the Son is the image, the icon of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And in Hebrews, we read it like this: the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, the exact representation, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. That there was this hope for this person who was eventually going to show up and eventually do it right. The scripture writers in the New Testament tells us that Jesus is the true icon. He is the perfect human. Now, I would imagine if you're sitting in the room this morning, you're probably not surprised that I said that. Even if you're not a Christian, you're probably like, of course, Jonathan, you were going to say Jesus. Like, Jesus is the answer for everything, you know? Like, people always ask me on Thursday, they're like, Jonathan, what are you talking about on Sunday? And I'm like, Jesus. They're like, cool answer, bro, you know? This time they asked me, and I was like, Jesus. And they're like, oh, yeah, really? I was like, no, really, I am. I'm talking about Jesus. But what's so fascinating about it, and what I think is so challenging, is that we think that Jesus is good for Sunday, but what about Monday to Saturday? For many of us, Jesus is relevant on Sunday morning when we show up to church. Jesus is relevant for our lives, maybe in times of devotional for 15 or 20 minutes before we go to work. Maybe Jesus is relevant for us when we have a prayer before a meal. But Jesus, for many of us, is relevant in this room on Sunday morning. That he's meant to be talked about and thought about and sang to when we show up at church. But what about Monday to Saturday? Do you think Jesus is relevant for your life when you're attempting to be a parent? Do you think Jesus is relevant for your life when your attempt to be a CEO, a leader, a boss, a friend, a coworker, a spouse? Do you think Jesus is relevant for those everyday moments in our lives from Monday to Saturday? I came across a quote from Dallas Willard in The Divine Conspiracy, and this is what he says. He says, our commitment to Jesus can stand on no other foundation than a recognition that he is the one who knows the truth about our lives and about our universe. And he goes on to write some of the most beautiful pages on the person of Jesus that I've ever read in my life. And not long after this quote, he asks the question, can Jesus be Lord if he is also not smart? Is he worth following if he doesn't have the answers to the questions in our daily lives? And he goes on to say things like, Jesus knew enough about molecules to change water to wine. That he knew enough about biology to bring dead cells back to life. He knew enough about physics to walk on water. That Jesus was the smartest person in the room. And if it's true that Jesus is the smartest person in the room, does Jesus also not understand our relationships? Does he also not understand our anxiety? Does he also not understand our work, our jobs, our leadership? If he truly is the creator of the world, then he has to be the smartest person in the room. And many of us, we don't think before we walk into a meeting on Monday morning, before we walk into a parenting situation, before we walk into a conflict with our spouse, before we walk into our jobs, before we walk into difficult situations. Many of us don't even think to ask him, what do I do? How do I handle this? How do I live this way? You're the smartest person in the room. Tell me, show me what to do. We sang about it earlier that Jesus is right there beside us, and he always has been our whole entire lives. If we've chosen to follow him, we can just ask him. And he knows. I mean, he's the creator of the universe. He's the smartest person in the room. And we have access. He's not just relevant for us on Sunday morning, but he's relevant for every aspect of our lives if we would just take the time to ask the questions. And they asked Jesus. Jesus actually tells us. I mean, he makes it really simple for us. If you brought a Bible, I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 22, but Jesus is talking, and there's a group of people that have surrounded Jesus, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they're always trying to trip Jesus up. They're always trying to question him. They're always trying to get him to maybe mess up so they can undermine his ministry in the world. And they asked Jesus, and this is in Matthew 22:35, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" In other words, when we think about all of the Old Testament, when we think about the Torah, when we think about the teaching that we were talking about, when we think about how do we live in God's world with God's people on God's terms, how do we do it? Which one is the greatest commandment? Jesus replied, and you've heard this before, but he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all your mind. He said, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Jesus literally takes 2,000 years of history between God's people and God, and he crams it into one verse, and he says it like this: love God and love your neighbor. And I want to be clear about something. I think we have a lot of, we've misinterpreted a lot about what we think love means in the world. Sometimes I think we think love is just whatever feels good, whatever is pleasing to the eye, whatever makes me feel joyful. But when you look at the example of Jesus, Jesus says that greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. Jesus modeled self-sacrifice. Jesus modeled laying down and giving up his life for the benefit of other people. That love is not just about what makes me feel good, and love just not is about what is fun for me, but love is about adding to creating or considering others as better than themselves. Love is about what's best for you, about me caring about your life. And to use language from week 1, God gives us the task and the responsibility to cultivate gardens, to make them fruitful, to make them grow. Maybe, just maybe, what it means to follow Jesus is to cultivate gardens in somebody else's life, to help that person grow, to help that person reach fulfillment in their life. Maybe the question you need to ask your neighbor is, how can I cultivate a garden in your life?